Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library. I'm very happy to be here tonight with Alex Myers, who's going to be talking about his ancestor, Deborah Sampson, someone you might have heard about in the Revolutionary War. And I think that there's just so much to unpack in that about Deborah, and we can't wait to hear from Alex about her. But before we get to that, I wanted to say a couple of things. One is I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our adult programming, actually all of our programming, so not just for the adults. And also, Alex was kind enough to let us partner with other local libraries. And, I always say that when libraries work together, we make magic. So tonight is a magical evening because we also welcome patrons from Clinton, Wellesley, Watertown, Andover, Wayland, North Reading, Manchester, Raynham, Somerville, Lexington, Newton, and Rockport. And of course, our Ashlanders, who I always like to see as well. So anyways, we're going to be talking about Deborah Sampson. Alex Myers and I talked, I was saying we had planned a program in 2020, April of 2020. Of course, everybody knows that the world fell apart at that point, and we weren't able to do it. So I was really thrilled to reconnect with Alex and have him come back and do this program at this library with so many of you. So welcome, Alex. Thank you so much for being here. And let's just start with telling us a little bit about yourself and your book.
Fantastic. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so delighted to see the names of all these Massachusetts towns. You're going to see a couple of historical mentions of your towns in tonight's talk, so that's exciting too. I am an English teacher. I'm an author, and currently I am the director of the Mountain School of Milton Academy up in Vershire, Vermont. So I'm living the rural life, and just this morning helped to herd some livestock to a new pasture. So you never know where life will take you. This is not where I thought I would be, but I'm delighted to be here. And I wrote this novel, Revolutionary. It was my debut novel. It came out in 2014, and it was a piece of historical fiction. And one of the things that was most delightful about writing it was getting to dive into the research. And for anybody in the audience who is an aspiring author, particularly of historical fiction, you'll know that it's altogether too easy to get lost in the research and let the writing wait a little bit. So one of the pleasures of giving a talk is to get to revisit that research and share what I learned about my ancestor. So
Alex, can I just interrupt for 1 second?
Sure.
So Alex is going to do a presentation for 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions in the Q&A afterwards. So you can use the chat to chat with each other. Have at it. But if you have a question that you would like for me to ask Alex, please put that in the Q&A after his presentation. Thank you. Sorry, go for it.
Not a problem. That's great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just to get started here. And please do think about questions you want to ask. I'm delighted to go off on many tangents in whatever directions you want. So as I say, I'm an English teacher. I'm an author. And to me, there is probably no more powerful force in the universe than the power of a good story. I think stories are how we understand ourselves. I think stories are how we understand the world around us and how we make connections between place and person, between possibility and potential, and how we really realize truths that are sometimes hard to access otherwise. I owe my love of stories without question to my mother. She is a fantastic storyteller, and I grew up in rural Maine. And for anybody who else is from rural New England, you know that it takes a long time to get from point A to anywhere else. And so my childhood was a lot of car trips to visit grandma or aunt and uncle or cousins. And wherever we went, my mom would have a story to tell, either about the place that we were going to visit, people we were going to visit, or where we were driving through. And it just helped me forge this sense of connection, that I had ancestors who'd lived here, that they'd done interesting things. And stories were bizarre and funny. I remember my favorite one, we used to drive 6 hours north in Maine to a beautiful little woodland lake. And my great-grandfather and his brother had loved to fish. And they had built a little log cabin on one side of the lake. And they had fished from it for a couple summers. And they found out, much to their disappointment, that the fishing was really better on the opposite shore of the lake. And they got tired of paddling over all the time to fish over there. So they waited until the ice was really thick one winter on the lake, and they just picked their cabin up, pushed it across the ice to the other side of the lake and set it up there. And I just love stories like that. They give me a kind of an anchor, a sense of rootedness, that I belonged somewhere. And that was a feeling that I often looked for as a child. Because as a kid, I was really confused about who I was and where I belonged. This is a picture of me when I'm 4 years old. And I always like to start my storytelling with this picture, because everything about this picture suggests that I'm a happy little girl. And I was. I was named after my mother's favorite great aunt, my great aunt Alice. She was a miraculous woman. She owned a dozen cats and they could do tricks. Specifically, if we visited my great aunt Alice on a Sunday, every cat would be wearing a bow around its neck as its Sunday attire, and every cat had to roll over before being given its Sunday dinner. Nothing short of a miracle. I own cats and they won't do any tricks. Anyway, I start with this picture because you can see at my feet, I've got a present and I'm about to go to a birthday party. And at that birthday party, an adult will ask me a quintessential adult question. What do you want to be when you grow up? And I will say, I want to be a boy. Of course, you can imagine that there was a lot of laughter and trying to explain why this was impossible, but this is where my story starts, because on the outside, I look just like a happy little girl, and I am. And on the inside, I'm feeling like I want to be a boy, because I did. And this was my beginning of my love/hate affair with language. Language is so powerful, right? The right word opens up doors. But at 4 years old, I didn't have the right word, boy and girl. Neither one seemed to work to explain what I was feeling. Here I am at 6, and this is when I realized the right word will do things that are amazing. And for me, the right word in the 1980s, for those of you who lived through it, was tomboy. All around me, there were tomboys on TV, there were tomboys in advertisements, and tomboy was a word that was positive. I could go to work with my mom and the women she worked with would say, oh, I was a tomboy when I was your age. And so it helped me think that there was possibility, that I could explain myself if I had the right language, the right concepts to say, this is how I feel. And tomboy was such a comfortable word. I could climb trees, I could wear these awesome fashionable overalls, have my hair cut short. I could say to people, yeah, I'm a tomboy. And they immediately said, yeah, I get where you're coming from. Tomboy, of course, comes with an expiration date. Little girls who say they're tomboys are expected to grow out of it. And so as I grew up, that word kind of faded away as accessible to me. And I was back to wondering, how am I going to do this? How do I manage to feel one way on the inside and not be able to explain that on the outside? And I like this picture because it's a school picture and I was told I had to dress nicely. And I clearly have won the battle with my mom over what I'm going to wear. Dress nicely to me meant collared shirt, and she always was trying to put me in a dress. And clothing is so important when we talk about gender, historically and today. What do you feel comfortable wearing? What makes you feel like yourself? And for me as a little tomboy, I loved my brother's hand-me-down clothes. I did not want to grow up, but it was pretty inevitable that I would, of course. And here I am headed off to boarding school in 9th grade. I was terrified to leave home, but it turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful experience. I left my small Maine town. I went to a big boarding school. There were people there who were really profoundly different from me, profoundly different from anything I'd been exposed to. And there were people there who were openly gay and lesbian. And this was pretty remarkable for the early 90s. But I was able to start to ask questions about who I was and how I wanted to live. And I was able to come out as a lesbian. And to say, maybe this is a way that I can explain why I feel different from other girls. It wasn't who I really was, though. And when I got to be the age of 15 and 16, it was pretty difficult. I was growing up, people were having expectations for me. I didn't like those expectations, and I'd run out of ways to explain how I felt, why I was different, and trying to make myself fit in only made me feel more and more frustrated with the world around me. And it was at this point in my life that I can really say stories saved me. I had a wonderful assignment when I was in high school, and it was called the Roots paper, and it was to research an ancestor. And I decided I would research an ancestor that I'd heard about from my grandmother, an ancestor of ours named Deborah Sampson. And here's a picture of Deborah Sampson from the 1790s. If you see the family resemblance between us, you can just keep it to yourself. And Deborah Sampson was an amazing woman. And the research I'll share now is what I did when I was writing my novel, but a lot of it was what I began to uncover when I was writing that paper all those years ago in high school. So Deborah Sampson was born in 1760. In the town of Plimpton, Massachusetts. Didn't see that one come up in the chat. It's not too far from Plymouth, where the famous Mayflower, Plymouth Rock landing stuff goes on. And she was one of 7 children, which was a typical size family for colonial America or the early American Republic. But when Deborah was about 4 years old, her father abandoned the family. Her mom used to say that he'd been lost at sea, but the truth is that he got on board a boat and the boat landed just fine in Maine and he got off it and never came home. So Deborah's mom was left to raise 7 children on her own. And it was absolutely financially impossible for her to do that. So she put Deborah out. That was the colonial term for giving your child into service at a young age. And at 4 years old, Deborah was given to a widow in the town of Plimpton and was that woman's servant. She did some carrying and some household cleaning and tasks that the widow couldn't do. The widow was apparently very kind to Deborah, taught her how to read, taught her how to weave, which was turned out to be a very lucrative skill for Deborah eventually. And when the widow died at age 8, when Deborah was aged 8, Deborah was old enough to be sold. And at 8, her mother sold her into indentured servitude for a 10-year term of service. Again, this would be a fairly typical early existence for a very poor family in early America. So at 8 years old, Deborah was the property of the Thomas family in Middleborough, Massachusetts. She helped with childcare. The Thomases had 3 boys. She probably helped with household chores of a wide variety, and she was responsible for all the fowl, ducks and chickens and geese that the household raised. She served those 10 years, and at age 18, so 1778, Deborah would have been expected to do one of a few things when she was freed of her indenture. She would have been expected to marry if she had a sweetheart. She would have been expected to sign on to serve another family if she could not get a marriage, or return home to live with her father. In other words, she was expected to find a new master. And all women had to have a master. They were property. They could be owned by a family and be taken care of by a brother or a father or a husband, or they could be a servant in a household. But masterless women were not a legal category except for widows. And even they really had a tenuous legal circumstance. But Deborah was a rebel in a time that kind of honored rebels. So she was at the right moment there. And she petitioned the town of Middleborough to become a masterless woman. And the conditions to do this were to prove that you had no quote unquote easy master. She had no father. That was fine. And that you could support yourself. And Deborah said, I can support myself because I know how to weave. So weaving at the time, sometimes we think of it as a domestic chore, but it was actually a very public occupation in rural America. You would go to a tavern and weave. Why would you weave in a tavern? Because looms were huge. They were the size of a double bed. They were very expensive, and you had to be able to fit it in your house. So you had to be super rich to be able to afford a loom and the room to put it in. Much more common was that you would rent a loom at a tavern. And so people would hire Deborah to weave their wool into cloth and to weave their flax into linen. She specialized in lawn. That is a very fine quality of linen. And so she would often just sit in a tavern in a back room with all the looms and the big walking wheels, and she would weave all day. And she could support herself in doing that. And this is Sproat Tavern. Sproat Tavern stood on one of Middleborough's greens for a long time. This is taken in the early 20th century. You can see by then it's rather dilapidated. It was a hugely formative place for Deborah. She says that in the 1778 and 1779, she can recall Colonel Ebenezer Sproat returning and standing at that very doorstep and reading aloud the brand new Declaration of Independence, and all of Middleborough gathering and cheering, and that she can say that she saw the town militia march out from a Sproat Tavern to do their service. So a massively important place, the one that put her at the corner of men's life, right? Because they would all come to socialize in the tavern. I will say, researching this book was a lot of fun. I did some road trips and tried to find Sproat Tavern since she mentions it so often. Alas, All that is left of Sproat Tavern is this. It is one of the original outhouses from the early 1700s. Middleborough Historical Society has preserved it, which I love. There's a little tiny piece. It's a really unique outhouse too. It's a 3-seater, and one of the seats is child-sized, so that you can go and witness this historical presence. All I could find of Sproat Tavern. So Deborah was really remarkable. She was the only masterless woman in Middleborough who was not a widow, and she supported herself for the next few years and managed to scrape a living. But in the spring of 1782, General George Washington put out a call for new recruits, what were called 3 years men. It was a 3-year term of service. It was the very end of the Revolutionary War. Most of the men in Middleborough and across Massachusetts had already served. Most of them had served in town militia or state militia and had no interest in signing on for the National Army. They were very skeptical of this centralized national government. And so the town of Middleborough couldn't raise any recruits that spring. And Deborah sat in Sproat Tavern weaving as the men around her talked about this. What are we going to do? We have to fill our roles. We have to muster this many men. And so they began to offer what was called a bounty. It was basically a bonus, a signing bonus. And it got up to 20 pounds of silver if any man would sign on. 20 pounds of silver was a lot of money. And so Deborah went to a house where she knew a maidservant and got that servant to help her steal some men's clothing from the household. She tucked her hair under a cap. She marched down to the recruiting office at a local lawyer's and signed on under the name of Timothy Thayer, pocketed the bounty, and went about her way. Unfortunately for Deborah, somebody spied her in that signing office, and Deborah had was left-handed, and she had an injury on one of her fingers that didn't allow her to bend it, and it was quite visible when she was holding a quill or when she was weaving, so people knew about this injury. And somebody saw that and said, "I think that's Deborah," and immediately sent out word that she had done this. She was apprehended, she confessed, she returned the bounty, and then they said, "We're not done with you. We're going to get the constable and we're going to put you under arrest." And they were going to arrest her because quote unquote male impersonation was a crime in Massachusetts. A woman could not wear men's clothing and could not claim to be a man. And so she quickly hightailed it. She stole a different set of men's clothes, cut her hair short, and began to go I'm going to skip these slides, began to go all over the state of Massachusetts. If we start here in the town of Middleborough, she went down to what is now New Bedford, thought about signing on a ship, got her first glimpse of the ocean and decided, nope, not for me. She went all the way up to Boston, that's the Green Line, and looked at signing on as a weaver's assistant or apprentice, but the town was flooded with young men back from the war. And then she went all around along where this red line is. In fact, she stopped at some towns that I saw in the chat. We know she stopped at Dedham, for instance, and she eventually ended up in the towns of Uxbridge and Bellingham. And there they were offering 60 pounds sterling as a signing bonus. She signed on under the name of Robert Shurtliff, and she was told, muster up in Worcester. And so she walked all the way to Worcester, and there she fell in with a company of young men who began the march to West Point. Now, can you imagine this? She's 22 years old. She's a young woman. She's been in household service and weaving for her entire life. She's never really left this area of Middleborough and Plimpton where she grew up. She's certainly never been alone and unsupervised like this. It was illegal for a woman to walk along a road without a chaperone. So the freedom to travel, the freedom to go to a new town, to live as a different person must have been intoxicating, and it must have been utterly terrifying to be in a group of strange men and to be effectively in disguise. She gets to West Point. They put the company through a bunch of exercises, and they select Deborah for the light infantry. The light infantry are the crack troops, the best of the best in the Revolutionary War. And there's often met with skepticism. Some people doubted her record when she said she was part of the light infantry. But at this point in the war, they don't have many recruits, and there were two very stringent requirements to be selected for the light infantry. One, you had to be tall. You can see on this fellow that he's got a musket that goes to his shoulder. You had to be able to draw your ramrod and load your musket. So that meant you had to be at least 5'6". Deborah was 5'7". very tall for a woman and fairly tall for a man. And you had to have teeth. You had to have teeth because your shot and cartridge were packed in paper or parchment and you would tear it open. So if you didn't have enough teeth in the right places, you couldn't load your rifle. So that's why Deborah was picked for the light infantry. And I share this image because this is the typical uniform and gear that a light infantryman would carry. And probably they were only issued one set of a uniform. And this probably helped Deborah a good deal. They weren't expected to change. They weren't expected to bathe that often. Deborah served for a year and a half. And in that time, she said they were forced to bathe 2 or 3 times. So all of these factors would have helped her maintain her disguise. And I call it a disguise, but in fact, I would say that at some point in her service, she fully became Bob Shurtliff. She was known by the nickname of Bob. And why do I say that? Because she served for a year and a half with a small company of men in an active theater of war. The British held Manhattan, and they would do these little raiding parties up the Hudson River, and they would try to raid the harvest. They would try to catch horses. They would try to burn farms. It was a campaign of terror to a degree, but also they were trying to capitalize on the supplies that they could capture. And Deborah was one of a handful of smaller groups that patrolled and put down these little raiding parties. So she saw live fire. She was injured and definitely took shots and gave them, as they say. But in some ways, the most remarkable part of her service is told in this picture. This is New Windsor, the final winter cantonment of the Revolutionary War. Washington withdrew his troops up the Hudson. He was in Newburgh, where his headquarters were, and just down the road from Newburgh, he ordered a winter cantonment at New Windsor. And the first thing all the men did was they felled a bunch of trees and they built these cabins. Originally, it would have had a stone chimney at each end with a fireplace inside. 16 men lived in this cabin for 3 or 4 months of winter, and the snow was over 4 feet high. They had a chamber pot inside, and they were expected to entertain themselves. Can you imagine 22-year-old young woman living with these men for 4 months of winter? This is why I think it was more than a disguise. This is why I think Deborah became Bob Shurtliff. Every record of service indicates that Bob Shurtliff was an exceptional soldier, and received praise and medals and commendations and even a promotion. So remarkable. And this was the story that I heard from my grandmother when I was really little. We would pick her up. She lived outside of Boston, and we would pick her up to go to the reenactments of the battles of Lexington and Concord on Patriots' Day. And she would tell me a very condensed version of Deborah's story. She would say, oh, you had an ancestor who so loved her country that she wanted to sign on and serve it. And she'd watched the boys march away from town, and she wanted to be like them. And so she signed on to be a soldier too. And at 4, 5, 6 years old, I felt that truth. I wanted to be like the boys around me as well. And when I did this research for this paper back in high school, I felt this immediate connection to Deborah. I felt this sense of she wanted to be free. She wanted to be who she was. And she had the courage to do it at the risk of everything. And I don't draw any direct lines. I don't think because I knew this story and my ancestor had done this in 1782, I thought I could do something similar. But what I do know is just after my junior year in high school, I spent the summer in Boston. And for the first time in my life, I went to a youth group for gay youth. And I went there and met other gay and lesbian youth. And on the 3rd or 4th meeting, the topic was transgender identity. And in 1995, the word transgender was brand new. But a young transgender person said a very simple thing. He said, being transgender just means you were born as one gender, but you never felt that was right. You always felt like you were something or someone else. And I was like, oh my gosh, you just told my life story in one sentence. And I asked myself, what do I do? What do I do? I've always felt like a boy. And I talked to this young person and he said, well, you live as you're supposed to live. You live as who you are. And I thought of Deborah Sampson at that moment. I said, yeah, that's what she did. And in short order, I came up and transitioned. I cut my hair short. I asked people to call me Alex. I started using he, him. And I went back for my senior year at boarding school wearing a jacket and tie. That was boys' dress code at the time. I was probably the only boy who was really happy about that. And I began my life as a boy, as what I'd always understood myself to be. And it was difficult. It was not without challenges. A lot of people questioned what I was doing and why I was doing it. Again, 1995, transgender was brand new. I had to explain myself over and over and over again. But you can tell from the smile on my face, it was also wonderful. It was how I had always felt. And finally, the world saw me as I saw myself. And so when I went back to do this research on Deborah, as an adult, as someone who had lived as a transgender person for almost 20 years by the time I wrote this novel and did this research, I brought to it a lot of experience of what it would feel like to pass as the other gender and to live that life and ask those questions and have those doubts. And it made me go back to Deborah's story with an entirely different lens than when I had first encountered it. This is a statue of Deborah that stands in front of the Sharon Public Library. And the ending of Deborah's story is a curious one. She served for 1.5 years, and after she spent the winter at New Windsor, the Army moved back to West Point, and then very quickly, after garrisoning West Point, they were called down to Philadelphia to put down a mutiny. And at the end of the Revolutionary War, a lot of soldiers mutinied. Because they hadn't been paid and they'd been promised back pay and they hadn't received any. And so all of West Point went down to Philadelphia, put down a mutiny of the Pennsylvania line. And there, the mutiny was quelled very quickly, but Deborah fell ill with a fever and was taken to a hospital in the city of Philadelphia, an Army hospital. And there, a doctor examined her when she had fallen unconscious and opened up her shirt and saw that she was female-bodied. And this doctor was named, I love his name is Dr. Barnabas Binney. And he took her home to his private residence, and he and his wife nursed her back to health. Again, remarkable that he would choose to do this at a time when what she was doing was very much illegal and would have been viewed by many as immoral. But Dr. Binney nursed her back to health, and when she was well again, he offered her a choice. He said, I have here a dress, and I'll give you some money, and you can resume your life as a woman if that's what you want. But I also have your uniform, and you can resume your life as a soldier if you want. And he told her that in the time that she had lain ill in his house, many of her fellow soldiers, including her commanding officers, had come by to inquire, how's Bob? Is Bob going to be up and about? We need Bob back. And they were really curious about how he was doing. And Deborah said, I'd like my uniform back. And Dr. Binney gave it to her and said, I'm going to write you a letter. And the letter is going to be something that you can give to your officers if you want to. And it'll explain that you're a woman and of noble character and et cetera, et cetera. And he said, I think they would be proud of you. And she carried that letter with her, from what we can tell, for a few weeks, maybe as much as a month, as she returned to West Point. And then she gave it to General Patterson, her commanding officer. And Patterson was stunned into disbelief, didn't believe that she was actually a woman. And then again, he did something truly remarkable. He kept her on as a soldier. He said, okay, that's fine. And soon after that, within the next month or two, Washington ordered West Point to be de-garrisoned and all the soldiers sent home. They were very afraid of mutiny, and so the soldiers were marched back to their hometowns, and many were remanded to the care of either a wife or a mother and told, don't let your man rebel. Deborah did not want to go back to her mother. Understandable. If your mom had sold you into indentured servitude, you might be a little bitter too. So she ended up at the home of her aunt in Sharon. And there she said she was her brother, Ephraim Sampson. And her aunt believed her. And from what we can tell, the town of Sharon did as well, maybe for the next 6 months, until someone noticed that there was another Ephraim Sampson living a few towns over. And Deborah had to admit that she was not really Ephraim, she was Deborah, and she resumed her life as a woman. This was really hard for me to write as an author. I wanted her to be free. I wanted her to continue living as a man. I wanted her to be able to be who she thought she was. But the truth is that she resumed life as a woman, married, had children, was a quite impoverished wife and mother, Her husband had a very small, meager farm. And then she had the idea that she could earn some money by telling her story. So she wrote what we would call now an as told to memoir. And then she went on the road. She became America's first traveling woman lecturer. And she did this because she had to petition first the Massachusetts House and then the US House to get her military pension. And in doing that, she collected her account and got a sense of this is a story that people are interested in. She won her pension. It was not much. It was a couple dollars a month. She becomes America's first woman military veteran to earn a pension for her service. And so she took this story and she went on the road. And this is what she would do. She would get up on stage in her dress and she would talk about being a virtuous woman, a mother, a wife, a true patriot who wanted to serve. And she would talk about her service. And oftentimes she could hear the laughter and the disbelief from the audience as this middle-aged woman is standing there telling about being a soldier. So she'd go backstage, put on her old uniform, get her old musket, and then do this. This is the military drill, sort of the shoulder arms, present arms. It was what she would have been drilled in at West Point. And she would do that right on stage to prove to them that even though she was a woman and a wife and a mother, she was also still a soldier, and she was just as capable as the men. So really a remarkable person who never stopped asserting her capabilities, her desire to determine her own destiny at a time when that was really not something that women were allowed to or legally capable of doing. So to say that she influenced me profoundly is an understatement. And in writing this story, it was a real struggle to tell it authentically for her time, not let too much of my own story come in. But it imbued me with a huge sense of gratitude to be able to tell her tale and to be able to compare my life to hers. I've been so fortunate to have a word like transgender, to be able to live as who I am and be my authentic self, to have supportive family and supportive friends, and really to live life as an average person. All of the things I think that Deborah would have loved to have been able to do, but the understandings of gender and of what women were allowed to do prevented her from doing that. And in my own life, I've just had the chance to tell such amazing stories and to be able to look at the past and understand what gender was like for people back then. Cisgender women and people like Deborah, who I would explain as transgender, lived such profoundly difficult, complicated lives, and oftentimes their stories don't get told. So it has been a real gift to be able to tell that and to share it with you. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions. And again, in webinar mode, you can put them in through the Q&A, and I will happily answer them.
Great, thank you so much. It's fascinating. I mean, both lines, your own story as well as Deborah's. I'm curious about, as I wait for people to put questions in the Q&A, the cover of your book. She's in a dress. So what was the thinking there?
So this was my debut novel, and my agent said about debut novels, you get to have one major hissy fit and two minor hissy fits, and that's it. You're not a bestseller, so don't push your luck. And her recommendation was save your hissy fit for the cover. So I didn't mind the cover. It has many elements that I liked. She was a weaver and she does a lot of sewing, and so I love the stitches. There's a lot of nice divisions where things are split kind of in half, but they're also united. And that to me is a theme of the book. But the image itself is not an image of Deborah. It's of a French soldier who served later. And so it's completely anachronistic. And the firearm, for instance, a handgun that she's holding on the cover was never something that Deborah would have used. Deborah would have used a musket and not had access to a sidearm, which were notably unreliable back then, very hard to aim, and would never have been issued to a foot soldier. But they liked this image at Simon & Schuster principally because when you fold the book and it's closed, the front folds in such a way that it looks like she could be wearing pants, and then you open it up and it looks like a dress. So they liked that element. I pitched a minor hissy fit. I didn't pitch a major hissy fit. And I said, I really think it's wrong to put a historically inaccurate image on a historical fiction novel. And they said, okay, thanks for the input.
Oh, I hear you. So Linda asked, well, first says, amazing story. Thank you for sharing yours and Deborah's. Do you know of any other women who did this in American history?
Oh, so many, so many. And I love to do presentations on sort of the hidden transgender history. In fact, Deborah was probably inspired by a woman named Hannah Snell, whose biography was well circulated in the American colonies. And Hannah Snell was British, but had joined the Royal Navy as a Marine, and served for 6 months. And her story was quite different from Deborah's. She had an abusive husband, and of course, women couldn't choose to divorce. Men were the only ones who could enact divorce. And so Hannah Snell ran away from home, and her husband pursued her. And the only way she could figure out to put enough distance between her and her husband was to get on a boat. And the only way she could do that was in disguise as a man. And so she signed on as a Marine, sailed around England, disembarked, and resumed her life. So Deborah would have read that story. It was very popular. We know of a couple other women in the Revolutionary War who disguised themselves as men. Most of them were discovered within a day or two. Some of them were fined and imprisoned. Some of them were subject to public humiliation rituals. It was called being drummed out. You would walk a gauntlet of drummers, and it was a kind of public shaming. And most of them were accused of prostitution. That's what the crime was asserted to be. By the time of the American Civil War, we have dozens of reliable stories of women disguising themselves as men. Some of those women disguised themselves as men, fought in the Civil War, were following sweethearts, and resumed life as women. And importantly, many of those people served as men and then continued living as men afterwards. And that was possible for them in a way that it wasn't for Deborah, because of things like the railroad and immigration. And there were a lot more people moving around the country, a lot more. In Deborah's time, if you can imagine and think of that map that I showed you, if you grew up in Middleborough, you stayed in Middleborough. You might go to Taunton once in your life. You may never go to Boston, right? And so when a stranger appears in Bellingham and Uxbridge, you bet everybody's asking, who are you? Where are you from? Do I know your people? By the time of the Civil War, there's no more of that. There's trainloads of immigrants coming in. So these probably transgender people could start a new life, and be able to do that. So there's dozens and dozens of wonderful stories out there.
We're going to have you back for that talk, because I'm actually super curious. So did she walk that whole way from Plimpton down and then up and then across to Uxbridge? She walked, right?
She walked, and a reminder that shoes did not have arches back then. So 150 miles she probably put in before marching from Worcester to West Point, all on foot. Conveyances at the time would be very limited. There was a stagecoach that ran. It was very expensive. And again, she would have been subject to scrutiny in the confines of a stagecoach. And so walking allowed her to hide when she needed to, and travel kind of privately.
Patricia asks if Deborah was Black or white.
Deborah is white, and there were people of color. There were both Indigenous people and Black people living in Middleborough at the time. And we know that one of her best friends, a woman with whom she often shared a room and probably a bed, because you would put 2 or 3 people in a bed at the time, was named Jenny Whitcomb. And Jenny was the daughter of a freed slave. And she and Deborah were good friends. And one of Deborah's laments of small town life, and particularly as a servant, was how separate they were from everybody else. And she speaks about the congregational church in Middleborough. And she would say, you'd go in there to worship, right? And the rich people would be up front in the nice pews. The poorer people would be in back in the not so nice pews. The male servants would be in the first balcony. The female servants would be in the second balcony. And the servants of color would be in the third balcony. And she said, what is this world that this is how we have to appear before God? And she was a woman with strong opinions and complicated opinions for her time around gender, for sure, class for sure. And from what small information we have, seems to have those feelings around race as well.
Mhm. Well, I guess my thought is that people are people throughout history and time and places. It's just a matter of what their opportunities and resources are, if they can get that out in the world. So Gretchen says, thank you for sharing. Fascinating story. She's curious to know about Deborah's family. How did they react to her amazing past as a soldier?
Very interesting. Deborah's mother, unsurprisingly, came by not long after Deborah resumed life as a woman and was around to ask for money. Deborah and her mom had a very difficult relationship throughout Deborah's life, and every time Deborah received some windfall, whether that was her pension or publishing this memoir, Deborah's mom would show up with her hand out. And I think Deborah's desire for freedom really came from a desire to be financially independent in some way. Her aunt and brothers seem to have been very supportive of her. And in general, the town of, she moved eventually with her husband to Stoughton, Massachusetts, which is kind of next to Sharon. And the town referred to her as the old soldier. And I love that. And she would often wear her uniform jacket when she was out plowing and working in the fields. And people would bring their children by and would say, "Oh, Mrs. Gannett, will you tell the story of you being a soldier?" And so she was sort of a local curiosity. And that to me is part of a great New England tradition of tolerating the eccentric people that you that you live in small town life, and valuing them for who they are. And so she was really celebrated in many ways, and tragically lived a very difficult adult life. She was, as I say, very poor. She'd been injured in the line of duty, and those injuries impaired her functionality and ability for the rest of her life. She predeceased her husband, which gives us the nice first, he becomes the first man to earn a military pension because of his wife's service, which I think is pretty cool. Yeah. But to emphasize how poor they were, she was buried in an unmarked grave. And it was not until in a century later that the Daughters of the American Revolution were able to fundraise to give her a grave marker. So she was well liked, but certainly it was a very tough existence.
So Marion, who is from Watertown and with the Daughters of the American Revolution, asks, did she leave any diaries or letters?
Oh, I wish. She left what would have been called her day book, which is really a record of household expenses. She left her wedding dress, which the Massachusetts Historical Society has preserved. And there's one piece of furniture that has been passed down through her descendants. And I gave a talk in the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and somebody claiming also to be a descendant of Deborah brought what they claimed to be her musket to that talk. It was not allowed into the library, thank goodness, and I have no way of verifying it, but that is another artifact that may or may not be out there. And the daybook is interesting. It records what she spent money on and where money came from, and gives us a sense of how she thought of the world. But by far the most telling artifact is the wedding dress, and it is a print fabric, so not expensive. And she stitched it herself for her wedding. And you can see, if you look at it, you can see no fewer than 7 different refittings of this to let the waist out, to pleat it, to raise the neckline, to lower the neckline. And what she's doing is, over the course of her life, she's taking the one nice dress she has and she's fitting it to the current style: empire waist, low waist, full skirt. And so that to me speaks volumes to her poverty, but also her desire to look good.
And her resourcefulness.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, self-reliant.
So Martin says, great presentation. He is reading A Girl Called Sampson by Amy Harmon. Then found some Googling to find other books about the topic. What differences are there between these other books that might illuminate why there are several renditions of Deborah's story?
Yeah, when I wrote my book in 2014, there were two young adult novels out. One was called Soldier's Secret, and the other one was called The Secret Soldier. They needed to coordinate those titles a little bit better. And I think for a while, Deborah Sampson was popular in the same way that like Molly Pitcher was popular. Oh, this plucky young woman who's just like out there with the men. And if you just peel back that story a little bit, you're like, wait a second. And Molly Pitcher too. What the heck is a woman doing on the battlefield, right? What is she doing there? How'd she get there? What was her life like? And the book that was just mentioned in that question, I have not read it. I've read a synopsis of it. It takes the other line that is often taken with Deborah and with other women who disguise themselves and serve in the military. And it's often a romantic story. Oh, they're doing it and they fall in love. And I'm like, you don't live as a man for a year and a half just to get the guy. That seems to me to be overly complicated. So I think there's a lot of different versions because people come to this story with a really important question. How'd she do it? Why'd she do it? And what was driving her, right? What was her motive? And I think different authors have different takes on that. And we'll never know. That's the fun of being a fiction writer, is filling in the gaps that are unknowable. And so it's always fun to read somebody else's take and say, huh, that's not what I imagined. Or that's so cool. I never would have thought of that.
I'm curious about the part where you said that they lived in for 4 months in that one room shack, I'll call it, as it through the winter. Is there any information about how she was able to keep her identity secret within such tight quarters?
Yeah, she seems to have volunteered for every mission that was possible. In other words, she got out as much as she could. So she was the person who would say, oh, you need someone to walk to the next camp to deliver a message? Me, please, I'll do that. You need someone to go track down those footprints in the snow that we're not sure who made them? Me, please, I'll go do that. She was very pious. She went to a lot of church services. She seems to have taken any excuse to get out of that cabin, probably to cover things like going to the bathroom because she wasn't going to use the chamber pot, probably to avoid scrutiny and having to sit for lengthy periods of time. And she seems to have just been a very competent, reliable soldier.
Well, no wonder the other soldiers loved her. I mean, she did everything, right?
Right, exactly. Midnight guard duty, no problem, right?
Yeah. Maxwell asks, it's sort of about the rabbit hole because you already talked about diaries and written versions and things like that. But what did you use for research, either primary sources or more reliable sources, to get the story?
Yeah, I read other soldiers' accounts that were written contemporaneous to Deborah to give me a flavor of what life was like. And one of the other bits of research that I did was I tried to find what she would have read. We know she was an avid reader. And so I read a lot of newspapers, almanacs from the time, and also literature to get a sense of what her worldview would have been. I tried to really feel what was the language used around her, what were the metaphors and conceptual framework she would have had. And that was really helpful. A historian named Alfred Young wrote a monograph called Masquerade about Deborah. And so he had done a lot of research. And I got to, once Simon & Schuster bought my manuscript, I got to work with Professor Young and talk to him about his research. And he walked me through some very obscure primary sources that were super, super helpful. So he had done all the archival stuff, which saved me a lot of time.
Did you get to visit some of the places? I know you went to Middleborough and saw the little outhouse that's still there, but did you get to go to any other places that she had been through?
I went to New Windsor as well. And other than that, it's a little bit hard to tell where she went. She says she was wounded in a skirmish near Tarrytown. Tarrytown, New York, doesn't have a lot of landmarks for much of anything from the Revolutionary era, particularly a small skirmish. You would never know that the British had occupied Manhattan, for years at the end of the war. And other places where she lived, her house in Stoughton that she lived in is still there. And you can see it. It's been moved from where it was when she lived in it, and modified, I should say, rather than moved. So the chimneys have been moved. And other than that, there's not a lot of traces of where she was.
Wow. Meredith says she has the limited edition of Female Review, The Life of Deborah Sampson. That's cool.
Yes. Yeah, that is the As Told To memoir that she wrote. So she wrote that with a ghostwriter, and it is a good example of very flowery language. It's also not a great historical source, probably about as fictional as my novel is, but interesting.
Well, Gretchen asks, why did you decide to make this a fiction novel versus a nonfiction?
Yeah, I love writing fiction because everybody's life, even somebody as well recorded as Abraham Lincoln, who you can account minute for minute for his life and on many days. There are these little gaps, right? There are these little sort of like lacunae, and you can insert a story into that and say, what would happen if? And so Deborah's story was perfect for that. We know just enough and can prove just enough. Her name appears here. There's a record of this there, that we can trace these little dots. And the fun of fiction is to connect those dots, and to say, I want to get to know this character, right? And there's no way to do it except through imagination. I want to get to know her, and I want to be able to ask that question: what would she do? Why would she do it? That to me is the fiction writer's job and pleasure. And so finding those little gaps and allowing my imagination to run free is really delightful, and much more, to me, enlivening and engaging than the research, which I enjoy, but is not the end of it for me.
Mm-hmm. Have you always known you were going to be a writer?
No, not at all. I didn't think I was going to be an English teacher. And then when I ended up as an English teacher, I was trying to redesign my writing curriculum one summer because I wasn't happy with how I was teaching kids to write. And so I came up with a bunch of writing exercises, and I started to do them myself to see how long would this take, what would it feel like. And in doing that, I was like, this is really fun. And so I started writing along with my students, and first wrote a lot of essays and short stories, and then gradually said, I really like this. I want to do something longer form, and wrote this novel.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that you would have written about Deborah? A couple of things. One, if she wasn't your ancestor, and two, if you weren't your transgender yourself.
I probably would have gravitated to her story even if I hadn't been related to her. Although I admit part of why I wrote about her was that I'd already felt like I'd spent a lot of time with her, and I had thought about her. So she was kind of present with me for a lot of my life. And I don't think I would have written about her if I weren't trans. And that's because I think, I have read rather many good books about transgender characters written by people who are not transgender. I think for me to give her voice authenticity, my lived experience was really relevant.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it. It makes it much more relatable in so many ways too. Marianne asks, what happened to her children?
What happened to her children? She had 3 children of her own with Benjamin Gannett. And then she adopted at least one and maybe 2 others. And she did that even though she was poor. And I think, trying to understand her motive, I think she did that adoption because she had been put out as a younger child. And I think she really wanted to nurture and provide family for poor young kids.
Mm-hmm.
Her offspring mostly stayed in the area for several generations. At least one of them remained living in the house for the next I want to say 50 years. It stayed in the family for a while. And there are many, many, many people who can trace back to Deborah still living in New England. I don't know that any of her children went on to do anything particularly notable or remarkable, but certainly lived in town and stayed around the area.
Well, they lived, right?
Yeah.
So Maddie says, wonderful presentation. Thank you for sharing your stories. Is your novel available for purchase, and where is the best place to get it?
I love that question.
Yeah, me
Yeah,
too.
you absolutely can get it anywhere online. If that's your shopping preference, support your local bookstore as well. They can order it for you if they don't have it on the shelves. I think the library can loan you a copy too. I've written 3 other novels and a nonfiction book too, if you find yourself liking my writing style. So have that.
Okay. So is there any place that you can get signed books from you, Alex? Like, do you have a
Oh,
website or?
I have a website, and if you email me through my website and give me your mailing address, I will sign a very nice book plate and mail it to you. And you can put my signature in your book.
Perfect. Thank you. And Barb's going to ask my last question, which is, what are you working on now?
I just actually finished a manuscript of a prep school murder mystery. So completely different genre. It was a heck of a lot of fun to write, and I will see if that picks up a publisher.
Well, we'll look forward to that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this whole conversation. It's been fascinating and a long time coming. Like I said, I've been looking forward to this for 4 years or 3 years.
Yes. Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for great questions from the audience, and have a good 4th of July.
Yeah. Everybody, happy Independence Day. Bye, Alex. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you.